And joining us now in the studio is Dr. John Lee from the Centre for International Security Studies at Sydney University. Welcome to Lateline.
Great to be here.
Now, China has revised its growth forecasts to 7.5%. It sounds still very impressive, but it's off from where people expected it to be. And in fact, it's quite a bit weaker than it's been for the last sort of 20 years or so. How concerned should Australia be about that, given so much of our prosperity relies on China's strong growth?
It's not the growth target itself that we should care about, it's how China achieves growth. And that is China going to continue on a massive fixed investment splurge, which it has been doing for the last 10 years? I think China will actually, because it doesn't really have much of an option for the next few years. So the growth might go down, but the spending on fixed investment, which is basically building stuff, I think will continue quite strongly for the next couple of years at least.
But of course, Wen Jiabao, the Prime Minister, says expanding consumer demand in China is the priority for 2012. Won't that kind of have mixed implications for Australia?
Well, if China could achieve that, that would actually be bad for Australia. But the Premier has been saying that for the last 10 years. And domestic consumption in China is the lowest of any major economy as a proportion of GDP in the world. Now, because that's the case, fixed investment tends to take up the slack of economic growth, and 7.5%, yes, is lower than the last 10 years or so, but fixed investment will still dominate the way China actually grows.
But it will be trying very desperately, won't it, to be trying to get Chinese to buy Chinese products?
The problem is that to increase domestic consumption, you need to raise household incomes in China. To raise household incomes in China, you need to stop offering capital to state-owned enterprises and start offering capital to the millions of private businesses throughout the country. Now, that makes very good economic sense, but it doesn't make very good political sense. The rise of the state-owned sector in China has really been the hidden economic story over the last 10 years, and China is a state-dominated economy. It's not a private sector-dominated economy.
And do you expect that to change with the new generation of leaders that will be coming through later this year?
I don't, and the reason is this. There are lots of factions within the Chinese Communist Party. There are lots of disagreements, but the one thing they all agree on is that the Chinese Communist Party should remain in power. And one of the key ways that the CCP remains in power is to ensure that SOEs dominate the Chinese economy. If you do that, you ensure that the Chinese Communist Party can be what you might call the primary dispenser of economic opportunity in the country, and in doing so, you tend to acquire the support of elites in the country. Now, if you change that model, that's very good economics, but it's very bad politics for the CCP because you dilute your economic standing and therefore political relevance in the country.
But that demonstrates a real fundamental tension, doesn't it, between economics and politics in that country, especially as they're trying to look outwards to the rest of the world and show a willingness to engage on the foreign stage in terms of investment, both inwards and outwards.
Yeah. The Chinese have been complaining that their foreign capital is not very welcome in many parts of the world, including Australia and America, for example. But the reverse holds as well, that the Chinese economy is still an extremely closed economy. And if you look at the last 5-year plan, for example, I think which was announced in March last year, it still wants to maintain a dominance of the state-owned sector in all key sectors of the economy. So the Chinese economy is an extremely closed economy, and you won't really have a lot of Chinese capital entering other countries if you don't have foreign capital entering the best parts of the Chinese economy.
Now, Bob Carr will take up his post later this week as Foreign Minister. What advice would you be giving him as far as focus in Asia?
I think Bob Carr needs modesty. If you read some of the writings of the private citizen, Bob Carr, he has some ideas about Australia playing the role of a bridge between America and China, of being an honest broker between America and China. He certainly shouldn't do that because that just simply won't work.
Why?
Well, Australia is very clearly in America's camp. Everyone agrees that the alliance with the Americans is the bedrock of Australian security. There is no doubt about that. Now, it's just unthinkable that the Chinese would view us as an honest broker in this kind of situation when security competition is actually deepening between America and China. So if we try to play this role of honest broker, we will just be rebuffed by Beijing and will just annoy Washington and won't achieve much in the process.
Because it's not very honest?
Well, we are not an honest broker. We have chosen our strategic side, and that is America. I think we should be very clear about that. That doesn't mean we can't have a productive relationship with China, but we should be modest about what we can achieve between America and China.
Now, China's just announced an increase in its defence spending, something in the order of 11.2% to around $100 billion. This comes off the back of last year having increased their defence expenditure by something like 13%. Now, the Chinese say this does not represent a threat to the outside world, but rather it's so that they can win wars within their own country. What are they talking about?
Well, there are a few problems with the Chinese position. The first thing is that is an understatement of how much they are actually spending. Probably spending around double of what the official figure is. The second thing is that they're not very transparent about what they're spending the money on. And the third reason is that they're not very transparent about why they're spending this amount of money. The problem is that China talks about domestic issues such as Tibet and Xinjiang, and that's certainly a priority for them. But the other problem we have is that China has a lot of maritime disputes with countries in the region. It's got disputes with Japan because of its claims in the South China Sea. It's got disputes with the Philippines, with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with Malaysia. Now, when you have such a big country in a region having all these claims, maritime claims against lots of other smaller countries in the region, anytime you see such a huge increase in defence spending, of course the region will be worried.
Should we be worried?
Well, it doesn't affect us directly in the sense that there's no issue of the Chinese suddenly being on our shores anytime soon.
No, but we're a big player in the region.
Well, I think what we should be worried about is that it's a disturbance in the regional order, if I can put it that way. China is not a direct military threat to Australia, but it's certainly a disruptive force in the order or the post-World War II order. Now, we have to fit China in somehow, but massive increases in Chinese military spending done in an intransparent way will lead to a lot of resistance against China in the region, and this is what we've seen in the last 2 years. Now,
just further to what we were just talking about this kind of relationship, Australia, US, China, three-way relationship. A Chinese think tank this week has advised Chinese officials to exert economic pressure on Australia to discourage Canberra from pursuing those military ties with the US. Of course, we've got the base in Darwin now, the training base for the US military and so on. Now, that sounds like a not-so-veiled threat, doesn't it?
Well, it is a think tank. It's a government-backed think tank, but it's not the government saying this. But the Chinese, as in the government, have been exploring ways of exercising strategic leverage because of the economic relationship they have with Australia. And the reality is that they don't really have it. For example, if you look at the Australia-China relationship in 2009, 2010, that reached the lowest point that it had been for probably 10 years. But the Chinese buy commodities from Australia not because they like our policies, but because they have to. Our commodities tend to be around a third cheaper than other competitors, for example, Brazil, because of our location. The Chinese simply have no choice. I mean, getting access to raw materials is fundamental to the economic growth. They cannot jeopardise that for domestic reasons. So it's very aggressive talk, but there's actually not much they can actually do.
And the Chinese government, if we can just move on to another topic, we heard there in Stephen McDonald's piece that the government continues to frustrate efforts at the United Nations to intervene in Syria because its foreign policy is pretty much don't stick your nose into our affairs and we'll butt out of yours. Does that sum it up, really, what they're trying to say here?
It does. And the Chinese take this position largely for this reason. They don't want a norm or a principle appearing in international practice where you intervene on behalf of human rights abusers simply because that same argument one day could be used against China. Of course, the human rights record is not the greatest.
Okay, Dr. John Lee, we have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.